Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm Twanda Turner Hawkins, and we are thrilled to present to you this discussion today in webinar entitled Restorative Justice and the School to Prison Pipeline, Cultivating a Positive School Climate. And this is sponsored by the ABA Commission on Disability Rights, the Coalition on Racial and Ethnic Justice, and the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is one of the many in a series of rapid responses to our current conditions, and also for our webinars. It's a series of webinars that we invite you to attend. We're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit the American Bar Organization Association and website for updates on these programs, including one scheduled for Friday. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions. Please ask them in the Q&A section of your Zoom meeting, not the chat. Of course, we'll look sometimes in the chat for it, but we would really love if you participate throughout the program in the Q&A section. And also we'll leave time toward the end of the presentation for questions and answers also. Please know that we are recording this session, and it will be available if you registered for this webinar ahead of time. And with that, I am and we are thrilled to bring you today's program, again entitled Restorative Justice and the School to Prison Pipeline, Cultivating a Positive School Climate. Today we have with us experts in the area, and we're really going to take our time with the subject and take a really deep dive. So our panelists today are Darren Atkinson, Restorative Justice Alliance International, Seema Gawani, the Special Counsel for Juvenile Justice Reform and Chief of the Restorative Justice Section of the Attorney General Office for DC. Dr. Kevin Gilbert, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Howard County Public School System. And again, I will be your moderator. I'm Twanda Turner Hawkins. I'm the Director of Global Litigation for Dematic Corp and Keon Americas. What I would first like to do is go around the room and give the panelists an opportunity to say hello, give their title again, and just say a little about themselves. Seema?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and honored to be here on this webinar and among you all. As Twanda mentioned, my name is Seema. I work at the DC Office of the Attorney General. I started here in 2015 with the then newly elected DC Attorney General Karl Racine. He campaigned for the office on a platform of juvenile justice reform and was deeply committed to innovation and reform. He himself started out as a public defender in Washington, DC, as I did, but found himself as Attorney General and running an office that prosecuted all youth in the District of Columbia. But he came into office knowing that young people who entered the juvenile justice system were more likely to have worse outcomes after they came out compared to those who were diverted in some way. He also knew how prevalent the rates of trauma were among the young people who were entering the juvenile justice system. And because of that, was really committed to looking for alternative ways to address crime and conflict that didn't involve penetration into the justice system. And so because of that, supported the starting of a restorative justice program within our office and its growth over time. So I'm very privileged to have been the person who runs that program and to be here with you all today. Thank you, Twanda.
So I can't really tell, was it Seema that froze?
I think I'm here.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Seema. Let me go to Darren.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Darren Aitchison. I'm the Director of Innovation and Training at the Restorative Justice Alliance International. We do training around the country and around the world in restorative justice. I'm also a doctoral student at National Louis University here in Chicago, Illinois. I'm doing my dissertation on restorative practices and mental health best practices coming together. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And we're thrilled to be here. I studied under my mentor, the legendary Dr. Ron Clausen. He taught me everything I know about mediation. So I'm very grateful for him for mentoring me and giving me this opportunity to come and represent ourselves.
Thank you, Darren.
Thanks.
Dr. Gilbert.
Good afternoon, everyone. And again, I'm honored to be here amongst this distinguished panel. My name is Dr. Kevin Gilbert. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Howard County Public School System. Howard County Public School System has approximately 57,000 students. We have we have 74 schools and 4 education centers, and we have staff of over 8,000. I work under the guidance of Dr. Michael J. Martirano, I've been here since he's been superintendent, which has been since school year 17-18. I come out of the restorative justice world in that I did work when I was working with the National Education Association, and I do partnership work with several organizations across this country that specialize in promoting the indigenous philosophies around restorative justice, the Restorative Justice Partnership, the Restorative Justice Training Institute out of Oakland, the Restorative Justice Partnership is out of DC, Community Justice for Youth Institute in Chicago, and Precious Blood Ministries of Reconciliation out of Chicago as well. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So I wanted to start out with putting some context around why we are meeting today and what we're talking about, and kind of lay out a roadmap to that. So first of all, there had been anecdotal talk and theories that we have this school to prison pipeline. But beyond that, we've had several studies, including with the American Bar Association, a study that started in 2014, and the report came out in 2018. And you can also track other studies, including the civil rights data collection, on this issue of a pipeline from school to prison. Based upon these studies, is no longer one-off stories that you've heard about little girls being handcuffed at the age of 4, or boys at the age of 5 being taken to jail, put in handcuffs and put in the back of patrol cars. We have actual data to show that it is a problem, and we can dive a little deeper and talk about how some communities are affected disproportionately. So just to start out, we'll talk about what the problem is. What is this problem from school to prison? To note that it is widespread, impacting the country, and also, as I mentioned before, distinct communities. So as of 2018, more than 250,000 children have been referred by the school to the police department. And they are also charged at a very high rate concerning discipline issues that do not involve violence. So it is at an alarming rate. So when we talk about the impacted communities, the data consistently has shown that the African-American population is impacted at a far greater rate than other populations. But there are also impacted populations of Indigenous people, Latina, LGBTQ plus. So let's just go through the numbers so that I can put some kind of formality around what we're talking about as the problem and the issue. For example, African-American students without disabilities are more than 3 times as likely as their white peers without disabilities to be expelled or suspended. Although African-American students only represent anywhere from 13 to 15% of the student population, they make up 35% of the students suspended. And once 44% of those are suspended more than once, and 36% of those children found themselves in the system even more than that. Further, over 50% of the students who were involved in school-related arrests or referred to the law enforcement are either Hispanic or African-American. But one of the things I think might be shocking to you is that Black girls are 4 times more likely to be disciplined as compared to white girls. And what you might have heard a lot about is that Black boys are twice as likely than white boys to be suspended or to be impacted about this when referred to law enforcement. So a number of people have asked and have studied, well, why are these disparities in schools? And what are some of the factors? And one of the questions studied would be, is it because these populations that I've mentioned before, do they cause more trouble? And the studies have found out that you can't purely explain this disparity from them causing more trouble. It's not explained by more frequent or more serious behavior caused by students of color. Although statistical and data would not end an inquiry about what is this problem, many schools have found that there might be 3, or many studies have found that there might be 3 reasons for this difference. And one would be, as you might be thinking already, bias. So a number of studies have studied the role of violence in this higher rate. A second explanation, which might be a really sensitive button for some people on each end of the spectrum, but that issue would be the increased presence of law enforcement officers in schools. And then the third one is that we've gone from disciplining students to criminalizing school discipline or behavior. So what I mean by that is that previously there have been a number of ways to resolve issues, resolve what we've called the lack of respect or students being disruptive. But now we've trended toward just purely making misbehavior criminal. So why is this topic important to us? There are a number of studies that show when you involve law enforcement, you send students to jail and or call the police and or charge them, that actually impacts their relationship with the community, meaning the community of school, the principal, the teacher, the other students, and it also impacts their ability to return to school and learn at the normal rate and or end up dropping out altogether, even if the students don't end up going to juvenile detention or to jail. So there are consequences to the problem that we are talking about today. But I don't want to leave you with just what the problem is. There are a number of ways that each community, each school, each legislator, each person on this line can impact this and or halt this pipeline from school to prison. And so that is what this distinguished panel is here to talk about today. So some of the things that, before we get to restorative justice, I mentioned to you before that we had an ABA study and we had a report out on that study. And I want to talk to you quickly about some of the recommendations that came out of the study in an effort to stop this pipeline from school to prison. So we recommend that we across the board adopt policies, legislation, and initiatives designed to eliminate, of course, the school to, pipeline from school to prison, whereby students of color, all students across the board, are recognized and treated as children and with civility. And also during this legislation, recognize those groups that I've mentioned already that are impacted higher than others. The next one would be to adopt laws and policies supporting legal representation of students at the point of exclusion from school, including suspension and expulsion. The third, support ongoing implicit bias training for teachers, administrators, resource officers, juvenile judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and other people dealing with juvenile. The fourth would be to require data reporting relating all incidents of reporting students to the juvenile and or to law enforcement. And fifth, support legislation that eliminates the use of suspensions, expulsion, and referrals to law enforcement officers for lower level offenses. In other words, nonviolent offenses. And the fifth is for state and local prosecutors' offices and national state prosecution associations. They should develop a screening process and for charging policies and statements of best practices for schools to even report students out to the juvenile courts. Now, the final one, but is by no means the least one, is restorative justice. And that's where I want to transition to the panelists. And first of all, ask each one of you, and I understand already that the definition might be slightly different given where you are and given your profession, but what is restorative justice? Seema?
Thank you so much. Well, I work in a prosecutor's office. We have a restorative justice program that I run. And as Dr. Gilbert mentioned, restorative justice is a concept that is both ancient and has its roots in indigenous communities in West Africa, in New Zealand and Australia, and in America. And the modern versions of restorative justice are varied. The model that we use in our office is called restorative justice conferencing. That model seemed to us to be the best model for the work that we did because we were trying to use these principles to address crime and conflict between individuals who've come to the justice system. And so for us, restorative justice is a mechanism to address crime where somebody's been harmed and somebody is responsible for causing that harm, with principles that feature things like empathy and repair and accountability and redemption as an alternative to the use of the current traditional justice system, which I would argue some of the primary features of which are shame and stigma and criminalization.
Thank you, Seema. Darren, what is restorative justice?
Well, on the school side, we asked two very crucial questions. How is power used and who benefits from the use of that power? Once we answer those two crucial questions, then we can go into intervene. And my expertise is mediations. So a victim offender mediation, which is similar to a conferencing that there's just talked about, where you get the person who committed the offense and the person who was the victim of the offense together to come up with a cooperative resolution, instead of just kicking them out of school for a couple of days or expelling them or giving them a detention or whatever. But it's all about power and how power is allocated.
Thank you, Darren. Dr. Gilbert, what is restorative justice?
Thank you for the question. I'll begin this definition by quoting Dewana Nicole, who's the executive director for the Restorative Justice Partnership, who says that if I have a relationship with you, I'm less likely to harm you. And restorative justice is the indigenous philosophy that's focused in on relationship building and building community. It is the philosophy that if I have this relationship with you, I'm less likely to harm you. But in the event that harm occurs, we can create a space that is suitable for us to work on this harm and move to restore ourselves into back and towards the community. So restorative justice is about relationships.
So I talked about what the problems were in terms of involving law enforcement and disciplining children. So what's the difference? Call the police, or should we call you all? What's the difference? Seema?
Well, I think I'll start by saying that since we're talking about young people and the school to prison pipeline, that the first response should be always that the schools and the family and the community should be able to address conflict or crime. You know, when I first came into the Office of the Attorney General, one thing that I did, I work in Washington, D.C., and I just did kind of some data crunching of the cases that had come into our office for prosecution over the previous like 3 or 4 years, and how many of those cases the arrest was made on school grounds at different schools in the District of Columbia. And what I was looking for was to see if there were kind of some schools that had really high rates of making referrals to the prosecutor's office, and essentially by calling the police and having arrests made on site. And there were, a handful of schools that had really, really high rates of young people being arrested and then coming to our office for prosecution. And that was interesting, but not surprising, right? Like if I talked to the prosecutors in the office or members of the community, they weren't surprised to hear the list of schools that I mentioned that we found in the data. One thing that was surprising was that of all of the arrests that were made, 47% of the cases were no papered. And what that means is the police make an arrest and they bring the charges to the prosecutor's office and they say, here, we've got evidence that this person committed this crime, so we want you to charge the offense. And in 47% of the cases, the prosecutor's office, under the old regime, which was like more of a traditional prosecutor's office, not a particularly progressive one, basically said, we're not going to even prosecute the case because it's so low level. And what that said to me was, it verified what you've illustrated, the picture that you've painted, Twanda, about low-level offenses that are being criminalized as opposed to dealt with in schools. But what also happens, it seemed to me, was that young people are being arrested on site in front of their peers, in front of their school officials, and going through all of the kind of trauma and criminalization that happens during that. They're being booked, they're often being held overnight, they're going before a judge, and then the case is being dismissed. And so what that says to a young person is, I've been through the system and I'm no longer scared of being in the system. But almost half of them come back and say, and nothing happens, right? So we're getting bad outcomes on both sides. So they're not, and I think that's like part of what you were trying to say in your data, that making these arrests causes so much harm, particularly when they are for very low level offenses, because it criminalizes the young people, and they are kind of what's communicated to them, at least in DC in these instances, was like, no big deal.
Thank you. Thank you. So Darren, how do you handle professionals who are resistant to using restorative justice?
Well, we have to remember that our brains have evolved from hunter-gatherer society. So we first started out as humans being worried about lots of danger. So our brains are still molded that way. So people are afraid of what they don't understand, something that's new. We have to remember that when we go in there. But we just have to give them the truth. And the truth is these things do not work. Punishment does not work with children. And when I say punishment, I don't mean it in the scientific sense, but in the sense of if you do harmful things, if you do harsh things to a young child, they'll shape up. Nothing could be further from the truth. It makes them more dangerous. It makes them more violent. So the current system is not getting them what they want. And every teacher knows this in the back of their mind. They know that something is wrong. They know the system does not work. So we have to relate to them on that level and build relationships accordingly. Like Dr. Gilbert said, restorative justice is about building relationships. We build relationships with the staff members. And the other things we do is we try to get a quick win. Sorry, I'm trying not to talk too fast here. I get excited. I talk really fast, but we try to bring the mediators in first to get some relief to the teachers, so they can see that the mediation system works much better. Our mediators have about an 80 to 85% success rate once they're fully trained of solving problem behaviors on the first try. Whereas those punitive systems at best are 30% effective, and that's being very generous. So the message is the system you have is not working. You've got an out-of-date telephone. I'm giving you an iPhone, but it takes time for people to realize that. We have to help the administrators manage them in the midst of that moment of a crisis, something new I don't understand, to something that will work for me. Excuse me.
Thank you. So Dr. Gilbert, we have a lot of people interested in the subject, and a lot of people are participating in this discussion in the chat. I want you to really take us really deep and tell us, you've told us what restorative justice is, but tell us what it looks like, how to implement the program, who needs to be at the table, how can we as individuals and or leaders in our community duplicate the great work that you all are doing?
Thank you for the question. And I'll have to begin by saying that the way we are implementing restorative justice in the Howard County public school system comes back to how restorative justice was actually rolled out in the state of Maryland. So the state of Maryland did some work some time ago in refining their code of conduct, work that was done by the Advancement Project. As a matter of fact, Mr. Cole, who's now the executive director of the Restorative Justice Partnership, was actually leading that work. And what happened is, just as you just reported out, is that one of the things that people asked for was an alternative, and I'm using quotation marks around the word alternative, to punitive discipline. And so schools across Maryland began instituting what they thought was restorative justice. The issue, though, was they weren't training our teachers. They weren't training staff on what it actually was. They weren't showing them how to be effective. And so what ended up happening is many educators then began to reach out, and organizations like Restorative Justice Partnership then began partnering with them to help them have a better understanding of what actually true implementation of restorative justice is. And so I start there to say that the way we're implementing restorative justice in Howard County is to make it effective. You have to ground it in this indigenous philosophy around relationships. It can't be utilized as this alternative to punitive discipline, and you can't automatically run into trying to do circles, or you can't automatically run into trying to do restorative conversations if you don't do the hard work of building those relationships. True restorative justice is grounded in mutual concern, dignity, and respect and value. And so when you ground it into those, then what happens in the restorative culture is that, as I said earlier, we're less likely to harm one another. But in the event, because we've built this relationship and something happens, I'm able to sit down with you to tell you, one, how the actions that were perpetuated upon me made me feel, and what I need in order to help continue to operate in this community. And you can talk about the things that you needed and why you did what you did. And see, people always talk about restorative justice not having any consequences, but I ask you, what is more of a dire consequence than the person who committed the infraction having to sit in front of the people he harmed and talk about what happened, and then have to give restitution to that, and then talk about how we're going to make that better. See, that whole process works when I have a relationship with you, because then I'm able to say at that point, I hear you, I feel you, and now we can come back together in the community. Now, I outlined all that to say that in order to do that, it takes a very steady process of really helping people understand that before we can get to the practices, we have to spend time fostering and nurturing and helping us come together with the humanity piece that is grounded in restorative justice. And so how we're implementing it, we start with an understanding piece. We have been using the Little Book of Restorative Justice by Drs. Kathy Evans and Dorothy Vandering who work at EMU University. And that book talks about how when you ground restorative justice in the principles of dignity, respect, mutual concern, then you're able to build those healthy relationships. You're able to build just and equitable learning environments, and you're able to transform harm and conflict in a manner that's going to actually be restorative and bring us to. But the key is you can't lose sight of where this comes from. Those indigenous roots are very, very important. And so we pattern our implementation after what happened in the Denver public school systems and what happened in Oakland school district, in which you start at that community building piece, and then you ground those practices there so that they become more effective. Because what we were seeing prior to that type of implementation is you were seeing a lot of people saying they were doing restorative practices, but you weren't seeing the kind of movement in the data that you necessarily saw. And because people didn't spend time with going through the true essence of it, teachers were going back saying, well, this doesn't work. Well, the reason it didn't work is we didn't spend the time as educators to ground ourselves in the essence of what it was. And we have seen in our district, so we are partnered with the Restorative Justice Partnership and the local union, Howard County Education Association, who is actually working with several of our schools inside of our district, around 7 schools, to actually implement whole school restorative justice in a manner that's allowing them to help teach our other schools in our school system how to effectively implement it. It's implemented through administrator buy-in, administrator commitment. It's implemented through staff buy-in. It's implemented through making sure that you are training your staff in not just the specifics around restorative justice, but some of those supplemental things that I heard talked about, where you talked about cultural competence, where we talk about belonging, where we talk about other things and other factors that are important to help understand. We're implementing it in a manner that says that we're going to honor our young people, we're going to honor our staff, and we're actually implementing it in a way where we start with our staff, because our staff is the driver of culture and climates inside of our schools. And if our staff gets that buy-in, then our young people are more likely to coalesce around that. And then we start seeing the kind of results that we want to see.
You're on mute.
Thanks so much. I also want to get Darren to talk about, very much like you did, Dr. Gilbert, restorative justice on the ground in real life, and what are the logistics and how it works. So Darren, if you don't mind, pull up your slides. But
Can I comment on something Dr. Gilbert said first?
Yeah, sure.
So Dr. Gilbert is absolutely right on the money, but we have scientific evidence to show that that what he's saying is true. Well, I'll get it in my slides. So
okay, so while you're pulling up your slides, I have another question for you, Dr. Gilbert. I want to understand how to get all of these folks that you've mentioned to the table and on board with restorative justice, because I think sometimes we just want a quick fix, right? We just want the problem to go away. But can you, while Darren is pulling up his slides, can you talk about how to get, who are the people that need to be at this table on whether it's a district level or state level to actually implement restorative justice in the school system?
Absolutely. And so, the beauty about restorative justice is it's a community process, right? And when you're talking about a community, you're talking about a learning community. And who are the essentially essence of that learning community? Well, let's start with the school first. And at the school, at the head person is our administrator, our principal. Principal leadership is essential to helping to move the needle in terms of whole school implementation. We start with principal commitment, right? So if we're doing for example, a 4-day peace circle training in our district, if the principal is not part of that initial team to be trained, then they're not trained. If the principal is not part of a team that is looking at the data, then they're not part of the process. You have to start with the principal, and then you have to have the staff buy-in. So our staff has to be our staff have to be on board with it. We have to get them to understand why it's important that we are implementing restorative justice and exactly what it is. And once it's implemented, how it's going to be beneficial for our students and things, but it has to come from a place of all of our staff understanding their role and why it's important that they embrace the philosophy. And then once we do that, we engage our students in a manner where they not only participate or are part of the process, because in true essence of restorative justice, I think somebody talked about it earlier, we have to break down these power dynamics, right? Because being restorative is not about being in power, it's about us working together. And so our students have to be a part of the process, and our families who are sending us the most precious thing that they have, their children, to our schools. They have to be part of the process. So we work with our schools to do all kinds of community engagement around what's happening in the school. And we don't focus solely on the discipline aspect of it, as we do focus on why it's important we build a rich community around restorative justice to help be proactive in preventing some of those things. And then, it's important, when you got your administrators, you got your staff, you have your students, you have your families, to engage community stakeholders in what's going on. And what you're actually building, you're building a true learning community. And that is the beauty of restorative justice. When we talk about this indigenous practice, when we talk about this indigenous work, we're talking about unlocking an ancestral, ancient philosophy that was grounded in togetherness and community. And that is how we build an effective. And I will say this, the challenge in an education system, in a setting, is that sometimes we want to move too quick. And we have to have leaders in place who are willing to pause and move as slow as they need to move so that it can be grounded and fundamentally etched in stone so that it can truly be effective for our school communities. And then that's when you start seeing the numbers start shifting and the things of that nature.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gilbert. So thank you, Darren. I see you have your slides up. And what I want to do is really let you take your time with this and not rush through this discussion. And one of the pending questions we have for you in the question and answer section of this presentation is, you mentioned a success rate of mediation at the school level. How is the success measured? And what does the success that you talk about, what does it actually look like? So we'll let you go through this, but like I said, take your time with this. So I'm just delighted that so many people are engaged and want to know.
All right, I'll get to the answer to your question here in just a little bit. So I call this the new war to end the school to prison pipeline. And some people don't like the use of the term war. That's kind of conflictive, but I'm okay with that, and I'll explain it here in a little bit. But this picture behind is called Earthrise. This is the first picture ever of the planet Earth from taken not on the planet Earth. And this is a moment where humanity realized that we were all one people. So we're going to try to help you get back to that. So in America, we have, in the Pledge of Allegiance, and liberty and justice for all, but in reality, it's a liberty and justice for some. So we have these large issues of what is justice, what is equality. Does it mean we do the same thing for everybody? Probably not. but we definitely have winners and losers in the criminal justice and in the school system as well. So what are the indicators of a future criminal, whether their school refers someone to the police? This is based on conditional probabilities. These are not exact numbers. These are just an estimate of aggregate data. I tried to put it in a pie chart so it could make some sense here. So the biggest factor of whether or not you get in trouble in school or referred to law enforcement is your skin color. As you say, Black and brown kids are much more likely. Your zip code is also is a second biggest factor. And the reason that is because of environmental racism. So I didn't bring these pictures, but if you look at pictures of suspension data, of maps of suspension data and lead poisoning, they actually match up pretty well. Anybody who can email me, I can show them this. And when you get lead in your body, in your brain, even just a tiny bit has tremendous amounts of damage is done to your brain. It inhibits your executive functioning, has all these other horrible consequences. So again, if you're in poverty, you're much more likely to be living in an area that has lead exposure. And the fourth biggest factor is what kind of discipline is the school using? Like Dr. Gilbert talked about, the other panelists talked about the relationship buildings. All right, is it coercion and threatening, or is it power with? Also, if you have a family member who's incarcerated, and also the race and role of the teacher as well is a factor. And also, if you have a police officer in the school, so you brought up the SROs, the data is very clear when the SRO is in schools, there's more arrests simply because they're there, and they're called more often because they're in the school. So we call this new area prevention science. It's the idea of stopping bad things or lowering the likelihood that something bad will happen later on in life. And we inoculate children with what we call pro-social behaviors. We do that with three primary mechanisms: restorative justice, acceptance and commitment therapy, and emotional intelligence mapping. But restorative justice is our primary intervention. This is our book from my mentor, Dr. Ron Clausen. It's called Discipline That Restores. We primarily do victim offender mediations. So what that means is when two kids get in trouble at school, we bring them together, have them come up with a cooperative resolution instead of kicking them out of school or giving them whatever the punitive discipline says it would do. And Dr. Gilbert was right on the money. I get that complaint a lot too. That we say if a kid gets in trouble, he goes and talks about his problems, and then he doesn't get kicked out of school, or we're not holding him accountable. But actually, the opposite is true, because this is what I see. Say a kid wants to get in a fight with somebody else. I want to punch Johnny. I know if I punch Johnny, I get kicked out of school for 5 days. I can endure that. So I punch him. We fight. Nothing gets resolved. I come back to school 5 days later, more angry and more upset. But when I do a mediation or a conferencing and I actually address the issue, the chances of that fight happening again are much, much lower. And the issue gets resolved, and I have to defend myself and explain why I did what I did, which is much more holding a student accountable than just kicking them out of school for a couple of days. Excuse me. So some people always say that justice is blind. Bob Kane, when he created Batman, said that in 1939. Some people still believe this, that justice is just what happens, but in reality, it's not. So the first person to come up with the term restorative justice was Albert Eglash in 1958. He had three kinds of justice: retributive, which is to get revenge; distributive, where you have the punishment meet the crime; and then restorative, where we work towards coming to a resolution of healing and restitution. So what most schools have is a combination of the first two. So retributive justice is fundamentally flawed. Well, no one in history, even people who are really, really smart, have never been able to figure out how to be both judge, jury, and sometimes executioner. So people like the Code of Murray, Oliver Cromwell, the people who first came up with the ideas of the state or the kingdom handing out justice and not involving the victim. And history has taught us that this doesn't work. So the Treaty of Versailles, the French American Revolutions, what's happening in Gaza right now, we see tremendous punishment, tremendous retribution being sent on these people, and it only makes them more bitter, more willing to fight, and it doesn't come up with a cooperative resolution. So distributive justice is also flawed. It's because of simple math. Justice can never be distributed evenly. As human beings, we're imperfect. And it never fails. In almost every country that we study this, every society that we've studied this, there are always winners and losers in the justice system. And the winners are the privileged and dominant culture, and losers are everybody else. So in America, that's predominantly upper and white middle class folks. And then so restorative justice is the art and science of making amends and repairing the harm that was done. It's an emerging science. It's only been around since about 1990, 1996. I think that's when Howard's book first came out, Changing Lenses. So we're talking about a science that's in its infancy. And our mediations, I talk about the 87% success rate consistent for nearly a decade. And the punitive interventions are 25 to 30%. So what that 80% success rate means is that if we have a problem, we bring the kids together, or the kid and the teacher, whoever it may be. we go them through a guided process. There's a script, there's a protocols that you follow, invented by my mentor, Dr. Clausen, and then been slightly amended by myself. And you go through the process with a trained negotiator, a trained mediator, to come up with this cooperative resolution. And then we have a follow-up meeting to see whether or not people have kept their agreement. If they keep their agreement and that same problem does not come up again, we count that as a success. If the same problem surfaces again, we count that as a loss. So it's not that the kids never get in trouble again. It's just not for the same issue. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So the second part of intervention is acceptance and commitment therapy. This is learning how to manage your thoughts. I don't have time to get into this in depth. I wish I could do a whole talk just on this, but this is the best that behavioral science has to offer. This is the shining jewel of applied behavior analysis. And it's really learning how to manage your thoughts. And these are 6 different ways you can manage your thoughts. But the third thing we use is called emotional intelligence mapping. This was literally just invented a few months ago by my colleague, Dr. Garner in Saudi Arabia. And this is a slide that gets stuck. Hold on. But okay, so, oops. So this is similar to active, where you're learning to talk about your emotions and to process your emotions before you go into a mediation. So when teachers use these strategies, predominantly restorative justice with these other things, the traditional role of an educator has changed from teaching and learning to also becoming a prevention practitioner. So we now have ways to pretty accurately identify kids as early as pre-K. So we're talking 4, 5, 6 years old, which people are likely to be incarcerated for 10 years or more and which are not. And based on those factors I showed you just a few minutes ago. And then we intervene. We have a comprehensive approach focused mainly on the adults in the school and not necessarily the students. And this is this is what we call this the new war in the school to prison pipeline. The previous interventions were primarily based on fixing the student, but when we were working with the adults and the student together. It's not exclusively focused on the child being bad or the child being the problem. Then we try to do 3 very important things. We take away the things that don't work: detentions, suspensions, expulsions, reprimands. We replace them with stuff that does: restorative justice, treating students humanely, cooperative pro-social behaviors. Then we coach the adults in the school on developing a new mindset to change their habits, which changes the school culture. And that comes from the top down. Then we help the administrators weather the storm as the dark age of discipline, which I call it, which much of the things we do in schools is rooted in what happened in the dark ages. It's replaced with one of that's rehabilitative and restorative. Excuse me. So teaching pro-social behavior interventions has also been shown to lower the likelihood that a person will be diagnosed with a mental illness when they're older.
Hey, Darren, I wanted to tell you that we do have time for you. So some of our members or participants want you to take your time.
Okay. Usually that's unusual for me. Usually people want me to get through this quickly. So
I told you we have a lot of people on the line and they are very engaged.
All right, thank you. So teaching these pro-social behaviors has been scientifically shown to lower the likelihood that a kid will grow up being mentally ill, to abuse drugs, lessen the chances of a teen pregnancy, and significantly lowers the chances that they're going to abuse their own children someday. So that's the thing that nobody wants to talk about, is when we make kids stand in the corner, when we incarcerate them, when we lock them up, when we talk bad to them, they learn those behaviors as children and they pass it down to their own children. So we're literally perpetuating child abuse to some degree. So we don't want to break that cycle. The other thing I want to say here is I didn't put this on here, but some of this is starting to become generational. So we have people who are arrested on these low-level drug charges, spend a lot of time in prison. And then I see this all over the country, mom, grandma, auntie raising 5, 6, 7 kids because her children are in jail. And then these children are more likely to end up in jail because they don't have a father in their life. So the system, it's kind of a snowball effect. Excuse me. So we'll talk a little about research here. So we do design-based research and single subject design. I'll just try to explain this. So this is our first study from 2018. This is all we did with mediations in the schools. So everything to the left of that staggered line is what we call baseline, what happened before we went in. And those were the times the kid was removed from school per month. So this first child, about between 10 and 15 times per month, he was removed from school for an hour or a day at a time. Then we implemented mediations instead of the punitive solution. And on the right side of the graph here is how many times he was removed from school. So we got him from 15 down to near 0 in about half to 3/4 of a school year. And then we did the same thing with the second child. He was removed to between 10 to 20 times. We got him down to near 0. The third kid was between 10 to 15 and got him down to near 0. And all we did was change what the adults were doing. We did not work with the kids whatsoever. except for when they took part in mediations. So it's about changing that mindset from punitive measures to restorative measures. And I want to put a little anecdote here that I would not have gotten this chance if it weren't for certain legislation. There was legislation that passed here in the state of Illinois that allowed for the use of restorative practices and required schools to put limit on harsh school discipline. So that policy opened the doorway for this study to happen.
Thank you.
This sort.
Go ahead, Dan.
So this, ignore the graph on the left for now. We'll come back to that later, but I want to look at this graph here on the right. So this is called an alternating treatments design. This is where we pit two strategies against each other to see which one works better. And I'll probably never have a chance to do this again because of the circumstances, but this top line here is the restorative justice measures with a few other things added into it. And this is typical punitive measures. So we literally alternated school days. And the only reason I did this is because the school was adamant that they wanted to see their punitive measures and how they worked. But normally I would do this because we don't typically alternate between something that we know is harmful and something we know is not harmful. So again, like I said, I'll probably never have a chance to do this again, but it's clear that the student was more academically engaged. That's what we're measuring here is minutes of academic engagement in reading and math. And as you can see, when we use the restorative practices instead of the punitive, it had a tremendous impact on her academics. Simply because we're treating her in a more humane manner. And this girl had a very tough life. She won the bad luck lottery. So even with tremendous trauma, tremendous terrible things happening outside of her life, using restorative practices and acceptance and commitment therapy, we were able to get her to where she can function in school. This is our first study where we combine the mental health best practices with restorative practices. So this top graph here is baseline. These are responses per minute of pro-social behaviors. So this is when we use the acceptance and commitment therapy, teaching people how to manage their thoughts. Then we went back to not using it, and we were able to demonstrate what we call experimental control, meaning that when we used the intervention, we saw the behavior that we wanted to. When we didn't use the intervention, it did not. And down here is the percentage of participation in restorative practices. So basically what this is saying is when we taught them how to manage their thoughts better, they participated better in mediations. So we don't know exactly if teaching someone conflict resolution makes them better at thinking about themselves, or teaching them to think about themselves makes them better at conflict resolution. Probably goes both ways. Scientifically, we may never be able to prove that right or wrong, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is that it works. So this is the study we just got published just a few months ago. This is the whole school instead of just one student. So these are number of reported incidents of violence per day. So you can see school number one had between 10 and 20 per day. And then in the blue line, we'll do the black lines first. So using restorative practices, we were able to dramatically decrease the number of violence incidents per day after about 3 months' time, about 55 school days. And the blue line represents the most violent offender in the school. So we targeted the whole school with restorative practices, and then one of the offenders with a more intensive restorative approach with some of those mental health practices, and we were able to decrease their violence as well. So don't let this chart for you. It's a logarithmic scale. That's why it looks kind of goofy, but it literally measures acceleration and deceleration of behaviors. So we were able to bring those violent behaviors almost to a screeching halt over time by making investments in people. And this is, I'm going the wrong way. So this one is hot off the press. This is not published yet. This is going to be submitted. But this is using restorative practices is the black line. And then the blue line is emotional intelligence mapping, and the green line is acceptance and commitment therapy. And basically what this is showing is that when we teach people how to manage their thoughts and manage their emotions, they are more efficient in their mediations. And the reason this is so important is because people will call us in, wants to do a 3-day training and save the world, which we can't do. Not in a 3-day training. But we're looking for ways that we can be more efficient and get quicker results because the time is so nil. And maybe a school can only afford to bring us in for 1 day or 1 day and a half. So we're looking for ways to make these procedures more effective. And that's what my dissertation is literally the use of these two techniques, emotional intelligence mapping and restorative and acceptance and commitment therapy, to improve the outcomes of mediations, to get better results quicker. And this is our good Samaritan model. This is the most comprehensive intervention we have, which is all the things I talked about with a little bit of FEI hostage negotiation tactics and some critical incident stress debriefings mixed in with that. And it takes a lot of training and a lot of expertise, but we have seen some schools that have started to be able to use that too. to pretty good results. So our final thoughts are how do we look at emotional disorders and conduct disorders? Because when we use restorative practices, these students do much better. So is it all a latent disability, or is it something that we're doing as well? Or is it some balance of the two? And what is justice? Really, America's got to decide what kind of country we want to be. We're behind the curve in a lot of respects with the use of restorative practices. Our colleagues in Australia and England and parts of Africa are much further ahead than we are. But I'm hopeful for several reasons that our current administration has placed a priority in this. There's a lot of dollars coming down to schools in the next days and months. There are 5 to 7 bills in Congress right now. 2 in my judgment have a pretty good chance of passing, excuse me. So I don't mean to be political, but if you want restorative practice in your schools, we need to have democratic control of the Senate. Some leaders have emerged. Senator Bennett's been a real leader on this, Senator Sanders and some of the others, Senator Warren. And I also feel like we have this, I call it a social awakening. And I owe that to my friends at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice and Black Lives Matter. You know, we've seen that a lot of people, especially a lot of white people, finally start to really understand what it's like for their counterparts who are different skin color. I'll just give you one quick anecdotal here. I spoke with a gentleman who was a medical doctor in New York, and he literally wears his medical gear, his scrub everywhere he goes, because if he doesn't, he gets pulled over. So we need to get America away from things like that. So it comes down to simple math. If the current trends continue, I believe that there will come a day in my lifetime where I'll see where white people will not be the majority anymore. And I think that is a real chance to be a real turning point in the history of America. But this is the last part of the new war in the school to prison pipeline. Is punitive discipline is a ripoff. It's poor stewardship. Not only is it ineffective, but it's very costly. It costs a lot more money on the average to send a young person to prison for 1 year than to send him or her to college. And that's true in every state in the union. But we're starting to try to calculate this monetary price in a new way. And I apologize, I don't have these numbers yet, but I've sent the numbers to mathematicians, and they're calculating as we speak. But when you take into account all the money that we waste on the prison system, instead of rehabilitating these kids early before their lives get worse, the costs are staggering. But when you take into account all the taxes that these people do not pay when they're incarcerated, which is the new numbers we're trying to calculate, we're talking about possibly trillions of dollars over the past 30 to 40 to 50 years. So we're spending a lot of money on a system that really doesn't work. And when I approach schools, I ask them, I'm not asking you to spend money, I want to help you save some money. So there's my contact info.
Thank you, Darren. So I want to bookend this discussion that we've had with you, Darren, and Dr. Gilbert, and ask you, Seema, coming from the point where now we've been talking about the school system and the way to implement restorative justice in the school system and working with administrators. Let's bookend it with your discussion. You're in the restorative justice department, and you run a restorative justice department in the juvenile justice system. Can you tell us what that looks like? Who's at the table? But before you get there and answer that question for me, because like I said, now it's outside of the school, right? It's the gates are open, and you're running a restorative justice system in the place where people want to send people to be penalized and punished, a very different concept. So I want to know how you even do that. But before we set that up, I've seen a ton of questions in the question and answer, and people have a ton of questions about how do you factor in and balance the school resource officer, and they're called different things, but in essentially law enforcement officers in the school system. Can you kind of tie that in with what you're seeing as you talk about your program? And then I'm going to come back to Darren and Dr. Gilbert and recognize that this whole school resource officer issue is a hot button issue for people. And I just want to get your perspective, even if they're different perspectives, because some people think they're good, other people not so much. Then there's in between if it's done correctly. So I'll turn it over to you, Seema, to tell us what this looks like in the juvenile justice system.
Sure, thank you so much. Well, specifically about the SRO, the school resource officer question, I would just agree with what the other panelists have said, that there is a really high correlation of young people who are arrested at school with the schools that have a lot of police officers in the school. And that can't really be disputed. And like I mentioned earlier, I think you're on mute. I'm not sure if you're trying to jump in and clarify.
I am trying to get in because I want to dispute it, because a lot of people want the officers there saying that it keeps their children safe.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting in Washington, D.C., as probably in a lot of places around the country, we've had really vibrant, emotional, difficult conversations about that very issue in our city council, in our community meetings, in our schools. And what's interesting is you have a lot of folks who are very thoughtful and progressive and caring, who say we need to get police out of schools. And you also have a lot of folks who are very thoughtful and progressive and caring, who also live in the neighborhoods where there may be high rates of violence, who say, no, my kid is unsafe in my home, in my community, in my school without police officers, and I don't want. And school officials themselves, I don't want police officers taken out of the schools. And I personally feel like both sides have a really good point. And I think in my mind, the answer is not, should we have police officers in schools or not, but more akin to what Dr. Gilbert was saying, which is, should we rethink how the school community can be a safer place for students and for administrators and staff? And if you are able to cultivate a sense of community and a school that can address discipline and conflict effectively and make everyone feel safe, you don't even need the police officers. It's a waste of their time there. And that's what many schools have done. Many schools have been able to implement restorative principles. And Dr. Gilbert mentioned Denver. I remember hearing about Denver many, many years ago. They were at the forefront of this, and they involved community and parents and students in the process. Oakland has been at the very forefront of this as well. What Dr. Gilbert said is right. You can't just do that by coming in and trying to create an alternative to discipline. You have to come in and build community. And each teacher needs to do that in their classroom, and the whole school needs to do that, and the principal has to buy into that philosophy, and it takes a long time, is my understanding. What I can say about people who feel very strongly that when a crime is committed, the student, police officers need to be there to address it, and the student should be arrested, and the student should be prosecuted in the justice system or the juvenile justice system. What I can say is that the juvenile justice system is really badly suited for most issues that of crime among young people, and arguably adults as well. And in particular, for instance, and I think one of the other presenters had mentioned this, but for instance, the whole bucket of cases of crime between people who know each other, which in schools happens all the time, right? Where you have conflict between individuals who know each other, who have known each other in the past, who have history, who will likely see each other in the future, you can arrest one of those people, you can prosecute them fully, and penalize them in whatever way the justice system has: probation, detention, group home, whatever those tools are, incarceration. And you will not have ever solved the underlying conflict, because in the justice system, because it is adversarial, the person who is charged with the crime never has any contact with the person who is the victim of the crime. And so there's no effort to reconcile the issue. And so what ends up happening is that the student will eventually come back to school or to the neighborhood or to the community or run into the person on the bus or wherever. And now everyone is even more likely to get in conflict again, right? Because now people are worried about retaliation. There's anger, there's fear, there's concern. And so you've actually made the situation worse. And so our justice system is fundamentally, at its very core, the adversarial nature of it, really bad for addressing conflict between people who know each other. So that's one example of how the justice system fails. Another is where somebody has been hurt, but culpability isn't very clear. right? And this happens a lot more than you would ever expect, right? There are some cases, of course, where somebody has done something bad to somebody else who's completely innocent, often a stranger. But there are many, many cases where the people have had conflict in the past, and there is some culpability on both sides, even if at that moment the final straw was one person hurting the other person badly. Our justice system will only look at that final straw, right? In the justice system, again, because of the adversarial nature of it, it's a good guy and a bad guy. That's it. And that lack of nuance is terrible for addressing conflict and crime. And it makes everyone more mad, right? Nobody learns any lessons when you've got nuance and you can't address that. And then the last thing, last kind of type of case that I think is really badly suited for the justice system, and a type of case that is really prevalent among young people and in schools and students in particular, is this situation where people can build empathy and understanding, right? So, and this can look like, on the adult side, hate crimes, right? Or crimes of bias, or just crimes where somebody is being cruel to another person. But in all of those situations, you can prosecute the person fully in the traditional justice system. Again, the adversarial system. And nobody learns any lessons at all, right? The person who is prosecuted, the defendant, the respondent, is even more aggrieved, right? Because they're like, this system has done me wrong. And the person who was harmed by it gets nothing really, except for maybe a sense of justice for a period of time, but most people come back. And so nobody's learned any lesson, there's no growth. And with restorative justice, you have the opportunity for somebody who's caused harm, maybe been cruel, maybe had bias involved in the harm, to understand the impact of what they've done and to hear how badly it hurts somebody, and then build empathy, build consequential thinking. And also in all of these models, you're building conflict resolution skills, right? You have an example of where you have to talk things out to work them out. And that's also building capacity. And so in so many instances, the justice system is not only not good for addressing conflict and crime in all of these situations, but actually actively is bad for it and is likely to create more tension, more crime, and more harm in the future. And so why are we using it to this extent? One thing that one of my mentors in restorative justice, Danielle Sered, has done a lot of research on and talks about is if you go into like the body of research about violence, and so that's like the final thing is like crimes of violence. What the research shows about what are drivers of violence, and the research is consistent on these across the board. The 4 factors that drive violence are isolation, shame, exposure to violence, and lack of economic opportunities. And so the justice system has those as its very core feature, all of them. Isolation, we're isolating people, we're shaming and criminalizing them. When they're incarcerated, often they're exposed to violence, and they have lack of economic opportunities after, right? We're taking kids out of school, we're incarcerating adults, and so they have fewer job prospects as a result. And so even when it comes to just violent crime among strangers and all of the situations that I haven't mentioned that hear about places where restorative justice can be much better, even in those situations, the punitive kind of retributive system of our justice system is really is arguably causing more crime. And so I think that the to answer your question after a long talk is to say that our justice system is terrible at addressing crime in most instances. School systems, especially as Dr. Gilbert has said, school systems that have invested the time and resources and effort into building communities that feel restorative and safe and that can address harm and resolve conflict on their own are far better. And even where crime occurs, we should always be pushing it back to schools and community to deal with them with restorative justice. What we do at the Office of the Attorney General is we only take for restorative justice serious violent crime. That's all. So we mostly don't paper the cases that come from schools, don't prosecute them. And then for the low-level cases that do come in, we divert them to treatment, almost a very high percentage. It's for that segment of serious violent crime that then we use restorative justice, and we do so because we know it's better for victims and it's better for the young people, and they're more likely to cause less harm in the future. So I hope that answers the question.
That answers the question. Awesome. Thank you very much. I promised that I would come back to Dr. Gilbert and Darren about the SROs. But what I want to add to this discussion, Seema, and to all of you, is talk about the SROs, what your comments are, and how do you get principals on board with restorative justice instead of solely calling the police officer. I'll go to you first, Dr. Gilbert.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. There's a lot to unpack there. I don't know if we're gonna really have enough time to really go through all of this, but so the first thing I'll say is this. So the issue, first of all, one of the things that we talk to our schools extensively about, and I know some people may disagree with what I'm about to say is, but the presence of a uniformed law enforcement officer in your school is actually counterintuitive to building a restorative culture. If the idea is for us to build a community where we look at how we can be proactive, the visualization of a uniformed, sanctioned law enforcement personnel in the building actually creates an antithesis and a conflict that happens within the school. But we have the reality that, because even in our schools, in our high schools, we have school resource officers. So that begs the question, so what do you do? And that's why it's very important that we invest in these proactive approaches. Where the issue comes in is where SROs are called in to handle subjective offenses or things that our teachers and our principals should be able to handle with the code of conduct or with our student handbook, and helping our staff realize that when you have law enforcement intervene in something, it increases the tension, one, but it also elevates it. For example, and we use this example a lot, if a young person is in the hallway and they're running down the hallway and a teacher says, stop running, stop running, stop running. And they zoom past the SRO, and the SRO just kind of reaches out and grabs the book bag of that young person. This young person doesn't know who it was going on, but the young person turns around, swings, and hits the officer. That is now assault of an officer. And that increases the likelihood that becomes a criminal charge. And depending on if it's in a middle school, you're looking at an 11 or 12-year-old who now has a criminal record. And so we talk about, in terms of building these restorative cultures in our school, is, and I'm going to really tag on to lots of stuff that Seema said in her eloquent response about, building community and using restorative justice as a proactive means to create an environment where you deal with your own issues, because we actually homing in on the deep-rooted philosophies that are evolved in this indigenous philosophy around dignity, respect, and value. And what that means is, if you've done the groundwork to build this community, and this is what we really work with our schools on trying to do. If you really build that groundwork, then there is no need to have a law enforcement official in your school, because you have created a community that values each other and deals with their issues from a humanistic kind of standpoint, and not this punitive approach. And that's why it's important, as we connect the dots to this, that we come from a philosophy of implementation around proactive strategies and not focus so heavily on the punitive approaches that go inside with that.
So Darren, thank you, Dr. Gilbert. But Darren, that sounds actually like, for some people, it might be frightening. They don't want to take the time to build a community that Dr. Gilbert is talking about. Can you address the school resource officer issue in your studies and findings? And just for a definition for the chat, is school resource officers, some people call them law enforcement officers. Some terms used are police officers. So we're talking about basically the police in the school system. Darren, can you talk about how to get principals on board as compared to heavily relying on police officers? Because like I said, it sounds frightening. I think some people would argue that would be frightening not to have them.
Well, first, I just want to talk about this on a very basic level. Is we're asking you to do something that they're not trained to do. We're asking a police officer who's trained to arrest criminals, keep the peace, to work with young children. That's not what they went to school to do. So that's part of that's just the beginning of the problem. Second, I'm not aware of any empirical study anywhere that shows that having a school police officer makes the school any safer. 3, like Dr. Gilbert said, and like Seema said, the very presence of a police officer in a school sends a message that we don't always want to send. And also in our credentialing system, we're starting to credential schools now. And in order to get the highest level of accreditation, they have to have removed all their school police officers. And I can tell you from personal experience, I taught in a very tough neighborhood in Chicago, a very violent neighborhood. We didn't have a need for school resource officers. And I can tell you that if we really need help, we called the police. They could be there at the drop of the hat. So there's no need to have them housed in the school. And the message that sends is exactly the opposite of what you want to talk about mutual dignity and respect. The other thing that a lot of people don't understand is that for many of these students, a police officer is a symbol of oppression in their neighborhood. So you're literally putting a symbol of oppression in your schools. And if you want to build a restorative culture, a positive school climate, that's just toxic. And as far as, so those are the things I bring up when I talk to school leaders about getting rid of the metal detectors, getting rid of the police officers.
Okay, so so we talked about the school resource officer or the police officer in school. One of the things we haven't taken the deep dive would be mental health issues. Seema and Dr. Gilbert and Darren, you walked us through the process of restorative justice in schools and Seema in the justice system. But does this all work if there are mental health issues involved, the trauma that we've talked about, ADHD, just disabilities? How do you factor that in to working with students in the restorative justice process? Or is this a totally different discussion that we need to have when we started talking about what are some of the recommendations to stop this pipeline from school to prison? We have seen countless reports, countless videos of children actually having from a temper tantrum to an actual side effect of one of their mental illnesses, and them being reported to the police and the police handcuffing them and prosecute. So can you kind of, just the way you talked about the school resource officer, can you talk about the impact and factor of mental illness and or disabilities?
Absolutely. So I'll give you neuroscience in 90 seconds. So your upper part of your brain is reasoning and cognition. Your lower part is your fight or flight response. You have this itty bitty thing in the middle called the amygdala, which is responsible for empathy. And that tells your brain which way to process it, through deep thinking or fight or flight. And using restorative practice has been shown in several studies to actually repair the amygdala or make it actually grow larger. So we're literally scientifically proven that we're teaching empathy.
Seema, thank you. Darren.
I'll say that, in DC, young people who are in the juvenile justice system, there have been some analysis that shows that that there are inordinately high rates of past trauma in young people who have come through the system. And there likely is overlap with behavioral health and special education needs. No doubt, we certainly see that in the young people who come through our office and in restorative justice cases. Very, very few young people, from my experience, are unable to feel empathy. And all you need to be able to do restorative justice is the ability to hear somebody else and understand the pain that you've caused them and the harm that you've caused. And very few young people are in that position. However, when you know that so many young people have experienced trauma, have experienced exposure to violence, many of them are dually involved in the child welfare system, have experienced homelessness, have family members who've been incarcerated, have experienced trauma, state violence in themselves or their communities or their families. What we believe is that the restorative justice process is always going to be better because it is at its heart, I think as Dr. Gilbert said, it is fundamentally based on dignity and compassion, right? And that is trauma informed. However, our traditional justice system is not at all trauma informed. And the features include shame and stigma and isolation and, physical force and surveillance. And if somebody is experiencing trauma, has experienced trauma, struggles with behavioral health or special ed or mental health issues, that's going to be exacerbated by the justice system as it is today. And with restorative justice, it won't be.
Dr. Gilbert?
If I can piggyback off of Seema and what she just said, I'll take it a little step further to say that, so what we see is that, what we say is that, being restorative and looking at like dignity and the human worth of individuals, and by putting that layer into it, can you truly be a trauma-informed school if you're not restorative, right? Because being truly trauma-informed is actually being informed, being willing to meet people where they are and provide them the supports that are necessary to get them what they need. And in order to do that, you have to have this kind of relationship with people who trust you and value you. But in order to do that, you have to do the groundwork to get that trust and value.
Right.
So we talk about, and this isn't mine. This is someone else's that I heard say that to be truly trauma informed is to be restorative. And so when we talk about mental health and we talk about these other things, disabilities, students with disabilities, and things in our schools, this actually, the approach around building a restorative culture is actually beneficial because it forces us as adults who are in that system with those young people to do everything we can to make sure we meet those needs and find them the proper supports that are necessary if we can't provide that for them. And they have to feel comfortable, our young people have to feel comfortable enough in that environment to want to be in community with us. And so we work with, that's why in our school system, we make sure that our counselors, our school psychiatrists, all members of the school community on schools that are doing this whole school have to be on board and have to be part of this process because we truly work together to meet the needs of our young people, no matter where they come. We meet you where you are. And in a restorative culture where no matter where you are or who you are, you're able to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Darren, did you want to say something? You're on mute.
Yeah, just real quick. I didn't prepare anything on this because it's kind of outside the scope, but we do have pictures, brain scans of people before and after restorative practices. And the trauma literally creates holes in the brain. And we have some evidence of the holes actually being filled, being grown back. They call it neurogenesis, the regrowing it, or the regrowing of brain cells, regeneration of brain cells. The brain is a great power to heal itself that we didn't understand not so long ago.
Thank you. So we're down to 6 minutes. I've tried to incorporate some of the questions during this entire discussion, but there is one question that is also consistent with what I'd like to be a direct a takeaway from this discussion. I think you all have very expertly described restorative justice to us. You've described what it looks like both in the school and in the justice system. So what I want to do is go to a question from the audience and also have it be a takeaway in our last 5 minutes and ask each one of you. And this question is that, how do we share this information, methodology with school leaders to change culture in various communities? Many school groups are very reluctant to change. And are you collaborating with education or educators in their advocacy associations? So I guess essentially is, how do we grow this process across the nation? What are you doing and how do we do it? We being everyone on the call in various roles. And I'll let that be the takeaway before I do the conclusion of the moderator. I'll start with you, Darren, go to you, Dr. Gilbert, and you, Seema.
Well, this is what I do. This is my day job when I'm not teaching classes at the university. We're willing to train anybody anywhere. So just send me an email and we'll try to get you in as quickly as we can, or we'll refer to somebody else if we can't, if we're booked.
And Darren, when you say that, do you mean a school, or what about a whole school district, or the whole state? So at what level are you training folks?
At all those 3 levels, but mostly at the district level.
Thank you, Darren.
We'll come in and train. We'll train a team of trainers to train the rest of the school, because it's more efficient that way, because we can't be there all the time.
Okay.
We're also working on an automated online system, which is not completed yet, but we think that will help us reach more people quicker and faster and more efficiently as well.
And so before I go to you, Dr. Gilbert, you had mentioned Denver. You mentioned California, a city in California. So there's a question, is there a school system to use as a model? I would guess you would add in your school system also, but take it away, Dr. Gilbert.
You know, we are a large school district, and so we are just actually really rolling out much of this implementation across the board. So I wouldn't put us in the same lights as Denver, Colorado, or Oakland Unified School District. I'm actually going to put the name of an organization in the chat. It's the Restorative Justice Partnership. You've heard me mention them quite often in here in this space. This is an organization that actually work with the Denver public school system, and it was formed by putting together a large community of people from a community organization that spearheaded it, that works specifically with the schools. And this organization actually specializes in working with school districts and working with schools in particular about the proper and effective implementation of restorative justice. They contract out with some very highly stalwarts in this building, in this work, from Rita Alford, Rita Alford, who's in Oakland, and she's with the Restorative Justice Training Institute, Community Justice for Youth Institute, Cheryl Graves in Chicago. And they have a very wealth network that really works with school districts, and working with them has forced this larger school district to really slow down and do the work. It's partnerships, it's bringing in people that you've gathered around, for example, to put this panel together, but it's more importantly in really homing in and plugging in to the supports that are out there. So yes, I would tell people, take a gander at the Denver Public Schools site, take a gander at Oakland Unified School District. I'll lift those schools up because I'm familiar with their work and the people who kind of work that. And then, like I say, look at this group that I'm going to put in the chat and see the resources and things that they have, and get together and work together with an organization that can help you as a school system think about doing this. And, you know, I'm always open for people who get my contact information out. If you have further questions to talk you through how we got started in a more specific way. I did send a report from our district that people can get to get more information. And so, yeah, it just starts with wanting to find the answers and work with people who are willing to help you. I took way too long, but thank you.
Seema, we have a half minute left.
I don't have as much to add as these guys, so it's fine. I would just say, I think this is in many ways political, right? If there is political pressure on your local city councils, on your state legislatures to do restorative justice, then there's more of a likelihood that those political officials will ask the school districts to do it and demand that kind of change. Because the politics of this are really, really tough. It is far more politically feasible and successful typically to revert to law and order. Police officers, prosecution, everyone wants the students to be safe. And so this is the politically hard thing to do. And so as a resident and a citizen, if you are able to advocate with your local politicians to advance restorative justice in your schools, there's a far better safe space for those schools to do this.
Thank you all so much for this great discussion. And I also want to thank the participants. I want to thank you for your chats and also your questions. And everyone can join us in continuing this very important work. And please go to the ABA website for when our next program will take place. And I wish you all, both the participants and the speakers, the best. Thank you, everyone.